Well, welcome, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio show produced by St. Michael Catholic Radio, based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and sometimes culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. My name is Dr. Karlo Broussard. I'm a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio 94.9 and 102.9. But you may be listening on your own local Catholic radio station at a different time somewhere else in the country, because the Catholic Reason is now aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. So if you're listening outside the Tulsa area, I just want to thank you for joining us today for the Catholic Reason. Just to let you know, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. That's Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes of The Catholic Reason at my website, karlobroussard.com, under the audio tab. All right, so to kick things off for today's episode, consider that there's one thing that divides Catholics and some Protestants, and that is the understanding of justification, which is a theological term that's generally used to signify a Christian being in a right relationship with God, meaning he's no longer subject to condemnation on account of sin. That's basically what justification means, generally speaking. The Council of Trent taught that, quote, not only are we reputed, that is, considered righteous or just by God, but we are truly called and are just, receiving justice within us. The Council goes on to state, justification is not only the remission of sins, but also the sanctification and renewal of the interior man. For a Catholic, God reckons a believer to be at peace with him, i.e. justified, because he, that is God, by a sheer gratuitous gift, has brought about in the believer, through faith and charity, an interior state of righteousness, what we call sanctification. So that's the Catholic understanding of justification. This interior righteousness that serves as a ground in virtue of which we can be reckoned or said to be at peace with God, to be in a right relationship with him and thereby no longer subject to condemnation. Now, Protestants within the Reformed tradition, on the other hand, are known for making a rigorous distinction between justification and sanctification, in contrast to the Catholic view where justification and sanctification are synonymous. Rather, on this view, they argue that when a believer is saved or justified, what makes him stand righteous before God is merely, only, God declaring him to be so, not an interior state of righteousness or holiness. Interior righteousness, they argue, accompanies justification, but it is not the ground for being at peace with God. So here's an example from the late R.C. Sproul. He writes in his book, Faith Alone, The Evangelical Doctrine of Justification, the following, quote, it's not the change in our nature wrought by regeneration, Trent's justice within us, or even the faith that flows from it that is the ground of our justification, being declared justified. That remains solely the imputed righteousness of Christ. So notice, Sproul denies Trent's teaching that the interior righteousness is brought about by God is the ground in virtue of which we are justified. Rather, the ground in which we are justified is solely the imputed righteousness of Christ. That is to say, God imputes Christ's own righteousness to us and views us at peace with him on account of that righteousness. It's purely a crediting to our account, so to speak, the righteousness of Christ, in virtue of which we are now justified. Now, what Sproul is saying is that God considers Christ's righteousness as our own. That's what he means, the imputed righteousness of Christ, and thereby declares us just. And that's the only way we can consider ourselves just. Whatever interior change happens within us, a change from a state of ungodliness to a state of godliness, it plays no role in our justification on this reformed view. That interior change would be regeneration, which results in a state of sanctification, something that Protestants like Sproul see as essentially different from justification. So, on this account, we're justified only because God says so, right? So the interior renewal would be labeled as sanctification, but harshly distinguished from, right? Distinguished from justification, which is brought about on account of God declaring us to be so and the imputed righteousness of Christ. So the question becomes, how can we defend the Catholic Church's teaching on justification as regeneration? In other words, how can we back up our insistence that the interior change that happens within us when we become Christians plays a role in us having a right relationship with God? Now, a full refutation of Sproul's view would require us to do two things. One, we'd have to show that the Bible sees the interior change that is wrought by regeneration at least as grounds for our justification, even if not the only grounds. And then two, show that the grounds for our justification are not the imputed righteousness of Christ. This would suffice to refute Sproul's claim. Further argumentation, however, would be needed to fully prove the Catholic position that the interior change wrought by regeneration via sanctifying grace given initially in baptism is the sole ground of our justification, or what the Council of Trent called the single formal cause. But due to the limited space and the time that we have for this episode, we're going to focus only on the first of the two parts of our refutation of Sproul's view, namely, giving biblical justification that our interior righteousness brought about by God initially through baptism serves as a ground, at least a ground, for our justification, for being in a right relationship with God. And there are three passages that we're going to focus on in today's episode. And the three passages will take up the rest of our time together. First of all, Romans 6, 17 through 18. If you're jotting these down, if you're driving, listening to the show, don't jot down. Wait until you get home, right? Romans 6, 17 through 18, 2 Corinthians 3, 6 through 9, and Romans 5, 1 through 2, and 5 through 8. Those are the three passages we're going to focus on to provide biblical justification that our interior righteousness or sanctification that God does indeed bring about, we would argue initially through baptism, but put that off to a side for now. The interior righteousness of sanctification that God brings about does indeed serve as a ground for our justification. And that would at least put us on the path and be one part of our defense of Trent's teaching, Council of Trent's teaching. All right, so let's start with Romans 6, 17 through 18. Here's the text. Here's what Paul writes. But thanks be to God that you were once slaves of sin, have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. Note that what I share here comes from my article at Catholic.com entitled God Puts His Money Where His Mouth Is, right? So everything that I'm going to say here orally is in writing in that article at Catholic.com, which you can get for free, actually. Now, the first thing to note is that the Greek word for righteousness in the two verses that we just read is dikaiosune, which is related to the verb dikaio that Paul uses throughout his letter to the Romans when he talks about Abraham, quote, being justified by faith in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. And then you can also check out Romans chapter 4, verse 2. And that's a faith that, according to Paul, God reckoned as righteousness, dikaiosune there in Romans chapter 4, verse 5. So Abraham is justified by faith, Romans 5:1, and it's that faith in virtue of which God reckons Abraham as, or God reckons as righteousness, dikaiosune in Romans 4:5. So for Paul, the state of being slaves of righteousness is a state of being justified like Abraham. Now, according to Romans 5:1, the justification that we Christians have in Christ is another way of describing the peace that we have with God. Again, a peace similar to what Abraham had with God. Paul writes in Romans 5:1, since we are justified by faith, and remember, this is a justification like Abraham, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So the question becomes, well, what does it mean to have peace with God? It means to be in a right relationship with Him. It means we're no longer subject to condemnation by Him. So the state, here's the point, the state of being slaves of righteousness that Paul talks about in Romans 6:17 through 18, the state of justification is a state of being at peace with God or having a right relationship with Him. Now, that's a key component part to our argument here in appealing to Romans 6:17 through 18 to establish our interior righteousness as being a ground for our justification. This piece, this part, is that slaves of righteousness, a state of justification, is having peace with God. That's our first part. When we come back from on the other side of the break, we're going to contrast that state with the state of slavery to sin and thereby further our argument. So stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. I'm Karlo Broussard. Talk to you on the other side. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team at the Diocese of Tulsa in Eastern Oklahoma. So in today's episode, we're looking at a biblical justification for the Catholic belief that our interior righteousness that God brings about within us initially when we are saved serves as a ground for our justification. That's what we're talking about. And the first passage that we began to look at was Romans 6:17 through 18, where St. Paul talks about how we as Christians have become slaves of righteousness, right? Obedient from the heart. And before the break, we were zeroing in on Paul's comment that we are slaves of righteousness and pointing out how to be a slave of righteousness is to be in a state of justification, which is to be in a state of peace with God. That was our first part of the puzzle here. Now, the next thing to note about Romans 6:17 through 18 is that Paul describes two states, both of which are preceded by and contrasted with the state of slavery to sin. First, he speaks of becoming obedient from the heart as opposed to being slaves of sin. And then second, he speaks of slaves of righteousness who were set free from sin, which is to say his addressees went from being slaves of sin to being slaves of righteousness. Notice the juxtaposition there, right? So we have two states, obedient from the heart, slaves of righteousness, both of which are opposed to and contrasted with a state from sin, a state of sin. Obedient from the heart is contrasted with slaves of sin. Slaves of righteousness is contrasted with being set free from sin. Now, given this common denominator of slavery to sin for both of those two states of obedient from the heart and slaves of righteousness, it's reasonable to conclude that Paul is describing in two different ways the same state that is opposite of being a slave to sin. So you have the common denominator, the state of being a slave to sin, and then the opposing, juxtaposed, opposite state described in two ways, being a slave of righteousness and obedience from the heart. This being the case, Paul doesn't see a hard divide between the state of obedience from the heart and the state of slaves of righteousness. In fact, he conceives of those two states as one and the same. They're identical. To be a slave of righteousness, i.e., to be justified, to be at peace with God, is to be obedient from the heart. And to be obedient from the heart is to be a slave of righteousness, to be in a state of justification, to be in a state of being at peace with God. And so here's where the Catholic understanding of righteousness, the interior change wrought by God within us by regeneration, this is where it comes into play. Consider that obedience to God, or obedience from the heart, as Paul puts it, entails the mind and the will being rightly ordered to God's will, being disposed to believe as true what God says and to do what God commands. That's an interior state, a state that's constitutive of our very character, constitutes our very character. It's this interior state of the heart and mind, a state that God brings about within us by grace. It's not something that we bring about on our own. This is an interior state of the heart and the mind that God causes, that God brings about freely, gratuitously. And it's that interior state of the heart and mind that Paul identifies as the state of being slaves of righteousness, which, as we've already shown, is a state of justification, like that of Abraham. Therefore, interior righteousness at least is a ground for our justification. Sproul and other Reformed Protestants, according to this argumentation and this text, cannot deny that interior righteousness is a ground for our justification. That is something they do. But according to this text, that is false. One cannot deny that interior righteousness is at least a ground for our justification. This interpretation of associating the interior state of obedience from the heart with the state of being slaves of righteousness is further supported by verse 7 in Romans 6. Paul writes there, quote, "For he who has died," and he's talking about the death of baptism via verses 3 through 4, "for he who has died with this death of baptism is freed from sin." Now, the Greek verb for freed there is dikaio. So the text can be literally translated as he who has died the death of baptism is justified from sin. That's the very verb that Paul uses when he speaks of Abraham being justified. So here, Paul explicitly ties this freedom from the slavery to sin, which, as we already said, is the interior state of obedience from the heart, to the state of being justified. So the interior state of obedience from the heart, which entails the interior state of the intellect and the will being rightly ordered to God's will and God's mind, is in fact the state of being justified. It follows, therefore, that in Paul's mind, the state of being justified is not divorced from the interior state of obedience from the heart, a state where our hearts and minds are rightly ordered to God, or what the Council of Trent called the justice within us, contrary to what Sproul and Reformed theologians teach about our justification being solely extrinsic or forensic. So we can agree to some extent with our Protestant friends like Sproul, who say that God declares us just. As Trent states, not only are we reputed righteous or just, but we are truly called and are just. The implication being that we can affirm that God reputes or declares us just. It's just that, according to Paul, such a declaration corresponds to an objective reality, our interior state of righteousness that God brings about within us, what Paul calls obedience from the heart. Again, as I already mentioned, it takes further argumentation to establish that the interior state of righteousness constituted by sanctifying grace is the only ground of our justification, or as the Council of Trent put it, the single formal cause. But at least we can say that Paul doesn't draw a hard divide between our state of being justified, being at peace with God, and thus having a right relationship with him, whereby we are no longer subject to condemnation, and our interior state of being rightly ordered to God in obedience. In fact, Paul conceives of them as the same, right? The state of justification, being at peace with God and no longer subject to condemnation, and our interior state of righteousness are one and the same in Paul's mind. And if that's how Paul conceives of justification, well then, so should we. So that concludes our reflection on Romans 6, 17 through 18. I think that is a great text that, when read carefully in light of what Paul says elsewhere about justification, akin to the justification of Abraham, we can conclude that we have biblical justification for the Catholic belief that our interior righteousness serves as a ground for our justification. Okay, so the next biblical passage that we can turn to is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Now, again, if you're interested in the written version of what I'm going to say here for 2 Corinthians 3, 1 through 9, you can check out my article at Catholic.com, How God Cured Israel's Heart Disease. And I must say that I'm pulling from other resources and Catholic biblical scholars who have commented on this passage as well. So what I share in my article and what I share here is nothing new under the sun. Other Catholic biblical scholars have utilized this text to show how our interior righteousness grounds our justification. So I can't claim anything here. And even with regard to Romans chapter 6, particularly verse 7, and being justified from sin, Jimmy Akin has written some stuff on that as well. Jimmy Akin being my colleague and senior apologist at Catholic Answers. So St. Paul begins with a prominent theme found in the Jewish prophetical tradition, the writing of God's law on the heart. And so here's what Paul writes in verses 2 through 3 of 2 Corinthians in order to set the context. You yourselves are our letter of recommendation, written on your hearts, to be known and ready by all men. And you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. So notice he's teeing up this theme of God's law being written on the heart. Now, Paul then begins to identify this written letter, or the law, on the heart as characteristic of the new covenant, in contrast to the old. So he says in verses 4 through 6, such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not in a written code, but in the Spirit. For the written code kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, this theme of God's law being written on the human heart in the new covenant is an allusion to both the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And that's from Jeremiah 31 through 34, and Ezekiel chapters 34 and 37. But I'm coming up on our second break here, so I'm going to hit the pause button. And when we come back on the other side of the break, I'll pick back up with these prophetical traditions from Jeremiah and Ezekiel talking about the God's law written on the human heart in the new covenant. So stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Talk to you on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. If you're just joining me, my name is Dr. Karlo Broussard. I'm a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers and a member of the Chancery Evangelization Team of the Diocese of Tulsa and Eastern Oklahoma. You're listening to The Catholic Reason, and in today's episode, we're trying to provide reasons for the Catholic claim that the interior righteousness that God brings about within us through regeneration, what we call sanctification, initially, ordinarily through baptism, but let's just say at our initial stage of salvation, is, or grounds, is that in virtue of which we are justified. In contrast to the Reformed position that our justification is solely on account of the imputed righteousness of Christ, and that God simply declares us just on account of Christ's righteousness, imputing Christ's very own righteousness to us, and denying that the interior righteousness that God brings about through regeneration is a ground for that justification. So we responded to that claim and tried to justify our Catholic claim by appealing to Romans 6, 17 through 18. Now, before our last break, we had just started reflecting on another biblical text, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. And what we were doing there is establishing the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 through 3, where Paul's talking about the writing of God's law on the heart. And he goes further to contrast this writing of God's law on the heart being something of the new covenant in contrast to the old. And he does that in verses 4 through 6 of 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, right before the break, I mentioned that this theme of God's law being written on the human heart in the new covenant is an allusion. Paul is alluding to the prophetical tradition of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So here's the text from Jeremiah. This comes from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. And here's what Jeremiah says. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. This is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it upon their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So notice there in Jeremiah's prophecy, you have God talking about how in the new covenant, he will write his law within the hearts of his people. That's exactly what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 2 through 3 and 4 through 6, as he begins to tee up the key text that we're going to focus on for our purposes here. But again, to further establish this Old Testament backdrop against which Paul is writing about God's law being written on the human heart, we can appeal to Ezekiel. Ezekiel, in reference to the time when God established his quote-unquote covenant of peace, that's Ezekiel 34:25. The covenant of peace, also called an everlasting covenant, according to Ezekiel 37:26. Ezekiel foretells what God will do in those days. So here's the quote from Ezekiel 36:26 through 27. God says, "A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will take out of your flesh the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances." So notice the emphasis on a new heart and God's spirit, ultimately the law of God, being put upon the heart of his people. The revelation that God will give a new heart to his people in the new covenant with his law written on it indicates there was a problem with Israel's heart in the old covenant. They couldn't keep the law written on stone. This is why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3:6, the written code, the old law kills, and goes on to call the old law in 2 Corinthians 3:7 a dispensation of death, and then in verse 9, a dispensation of condemnation. The ground for condemnation was disobedience. That's an important point there. The old law gave knowledge of what must be obeyed, but did not give the power to obey. So the ground for condemnation was disobedience. Now for Paul, who's thinking in the same vein as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the solution that he identifies as the new law is proportionate to the problem. The problem for the people of Israel was an interior matter, a matter of the heart. And so therefore the solution must be an interior matter because it's a matter of the heart as well. So note again, the problem for Israel was a heart problem. It was an interior matter, a failure to obey. It was a matter of the heart. That was the problem. And so the solution is going to have to be proportionate. What is the solution? The new law written upon the hearts of the people. So it's going to be a matter of the heart. Now, so far, everything I've said maps on to what a Protestant persuaded by the Reformed tradition would say happens with sanctification. focusing on focusing on the interior aspect of things, where you have it being a matter of the heart and the transformation of the heart and the new heart. Those of the Reformed tradition would say that's sanctification. So the trick now is to connect the interior transformation that Paul speaks of in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, that which is a matter of the heart, the new law written on the heart, to connect that with justification. And here's how we do it. The key is found in verses 7 through 9. Here's what Paul writes. Now, if the dispensation of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such splendor that the Israelites could not look at Moses' face because of its brightness, fading as this was, will not the dispensation of the Spirit be attended with greater splendor? For if there was a splendor in the dispensation of condemnation, the old law, the old covenant, the dispensation of righteousness must far exceed it in splendor. Indeed, in this case, what once had splendor has come to have no splendor at all, because of the splendor that surpasses it. Notice that Paul calls the new law the dispensation of righteousness and contrasts it with the old law, which he calls the dispensation of death in verse 7 and the dispensation of condemnation in verse 9. Now check it out. The Greek word for righteousness is dikaiosune. And of course, as we've mentioned already, that's related to the verb dikaio, which means to justify or to make righteous, to declare righteous. These are the words Paul uses when he explicates his doctrine of justification in his letter to the Romans. Romans 3:28, for we hold that a man is justified, right? Dikaiosune is being used there, or dikaio is being used there, by faith apart from works of law. Romans 4:5, to one who does not work but trust him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness, dikaiosunen. This contrast shows that Paul views the result of the old law as the opposite of righteousness, i.e., unrighteousness. And given what we've already said, that the result of the old law was a heart problem, the problem of Israel that the new law is meant to rectify, right? It follows that the people's unrighteousness under the old law was something interior. It was a matter of the heart. The ground for the legal act of condemnation, therefore, was the Israelites' interior state of unrighteousness brought about through disobedience. Now, for Paul, the interior transformation that the new dispensation brings with God's law written on man's heart is the proportionate solution to the problem of unrighteousness characteristic of Israel under the old law. This is why Paul calls the new law a dispensation of righteousness. Again, dikaiosune. Since the unrighteousness of Israel under the old law was something interior, a matter of the heart, and the righteousness that the new law written on the heart brings is intended by God to rectify that unrighteousness and make God's people no longer subject to condemnation, well, then it follows that the righteousness that the new law brings about is an interior righteousness, a matter of the heart. Or as Bible scholar John Kincaid puts it in his essay in the book Paul, a New Covenant Jew, Rethinking Pauline Theology, cardiac righteousness. And that's the essay where a lot of this material is being drawn from. Kincaid does a good job of exegeting this text in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. For Paul, therefore, the ground for no longer being condemned, or to put it differently, the ground for being justified is the believer's, to use Kincaid's phraseology, cardiac righteousness, an interior state of righteousness that brings about in his soul, that God brings about in his soul. And since justification is a transformation of the heart, resulting in an interior state of righteousness, we don't have to draw a hard line between justification and sanctification. So that's the beauty of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, where Paul is juxtaposing and interior state of unrighteousness for the old Israel in the old law, in the old dispensation, with the dispensation of the new law for the new Israel. And given that juxtaposition, we can reasonably conclude that Paul envisions the state of righteousness under the new law in the dispensation of righteousness is one of an interior righteousness, because the solution, which the state of righteousness in the dispensation of righteousness is, must be proportionate to the problem. The problem was interior unrighteousness, so the solution must be interior righteousness, and that's the dispensation of righteousness. My friends, I'm coming up on the break. Talk to you on the other side. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back to The Catholic Reason, my friends. Here we are in our last and final segment of today's episode. So by way of summary, we've looked at two biblical passages so far to provide justification for the Catholic claim that our interior righteousness that God brings about through regeneration is our grounds, our state of justice, is that in virtue of which we are justified in a state of right relationship with God, thereby no longer being subject to condemnation. We looked at Romans 6:17 through 18, and that provided us evidence for that. In Paul's mind, Paul envisions a state of justification, or being slaves of righteousness, is a matter of the heart, something interior, being set free and juxtaposed to the state of sin. Given that the state of sin is something interior, and Paul juxtaposes that state of sin and being slaves of sin with being slaves of righteousness, or a state of justification, it follows that for Paul, the state of justification is something that's interior. There's an interior righteousness there that serves as the ground in virtue of which we are justified or in a right relationship with God. Now, secondly, we looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. And there Paul talks about how in the new law, God has written his law upon our hearts. So he tees up the theology of the heart, something interior, right? And Paul teaches us that in those passages that this new law written on the heart is the solution in this dispensation of righteousness to the problem for Israel in the old law, which was a dispensation of death and condemnation, which was a matter of the heart. It was the heart being unrighteous, lack of obedience and disobedience. And given that the problem was an interior issue, a matter of the heart, and the solution to the problem needs to be proportionate to that, the solution to the problem is the dispensation of righteousness, the law of God written upon our heart, it follows that the solution is going to be something of an interior matter. It's going to be a matter of the heart. And so this dispensation of righteousness, or being justified, is something of the heart. The interior righteousness that God brings about is that in virtue of which we are justified. And so now in our last segment, let's look at a third biblical passage that justifies the Catholic understanding of justification being a matter of the heart. Justification being interior righteousness, being grounded or rooted in the interior righteousness that God brings about. So here's what Paul writes, Romans 5, 1 through 2, and verses 5 through 8. Verse 1, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Starting verse 5, and hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. For Christ, while we were still helpless, yet died at the appointed time for the ungodly. Indeed, only with difficulty does one die for a just person, though perhaps for a good person one might even find courage to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The point of focus here is Paul's teaching on the state of justification as contrasted with a Christian's former state of ungodliness. Now, note that I'm not claiming that this text provides us a full-blown defense of the Council of Trent's teaching on justification, as I articulated at the beginning of the episode. However, it does show, so I will argue, that at least our interior state of righteousness or holiness serves as a ground for our justification. Like I said earlier, more work would have to be done to show that it's the only ground, but at least we can show in this passage of Romans 5, 1 through 2 and 5 through 8 that our interior righteousness that God brings about is a ground. Consider that Paul clearly has justification in mind, since he writes in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God. So he has justification in mind. Our question is, how does Paul conceive of justification within his mind? What does he think the nature of justification involves? Well, let's start with Paul's juxtaposition of what he calls the ungodly state in verse 6, or being sinners in verse 8, and the state of having God's love poured into our hearts there in verse 5. Paul describes the former state, the ungodly state, the state of being sinners, of both he and the Christians in Rome as being in an ungodly state, which according to verse 8 involved the state of sin whereby they were interiorly defiled. This would have been a state of sin where the soul is void of sanctifying grace due to what we call in the Catholic tradition mortal sin. So Paul is envisioning, he's describing himself and the Romans as being in that ungodly sinful state, which is an interior defilement. But the good news is that both Paul and Roman Christians were taken out of that state of defilement due to sin, as Paul writes, that defilement due to, let me rephrase that. The good news is that Paul and the Roman Christians were taken out of that state of defilement, which was a state of sin, right? And they're taking out of that state of defilement due to, as Paul writes, the love of God that has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us, there in verse 5. So notice, because the love of God has been poured forth in their heart, they have been taken out of the state of defilement or the state of ungodliness or the state of sin. Now, the heart, remember, Paul says the love of God has been poured forth into our hearts. The heart in the Bible signifies the interior core of the person. So for Paul, the state opposite of being in an ungodly state is one of interiority. It's something within us. And that interior state is having the love of God within us, which makes us interiorly holy. Now, what's interesting is that Paul also identifies the state opposite of an ungodly state as the state of being justified. Again, he acknowledges that he and the Christians in Rome have been justified in verse 1 of Romans 5, but he juxtaposes that state of justification with their former state of being ungodly. Here's what he writes in verses 7 through 8 of Romans 5. Indeed, only with difficulty does one die for a just person, though perhaps for a good person one might even find courage to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Notice the juxtaposition between being sinners and the just person. Paul is saying that when they were in an ungodly state, which is a sinful state, they were not just. The implication here is that since they're no longer in that ungodly state, they are now just. So for Paul, the state opposite of being in a state of ungodliness is a state of being justified. But he describes that same single state as having the love of God within our hearts, thereby indicating that Paul conceives our state of justification as being constituted by God's love within our hearts. And since having God's love in our hearts constitutes an interior holiness, well, then it follows that Paul conceives of justification as involving a state of interior holiness. So just to summarize that, in this text of Romans 5, 1 through 2 and 5 through 8, Paul is juxtaposing two states. One state is an ungodly state, which he identifies as a state of sin. And he juxtaposes that state with another state, which he describes in two different ways. He juxtaposes the ungodly state with having God's love in our hearts, and he juxtaposes the state of ungodliness with the state of justification, of having peace with God. And so given that you have this common denominator of the ungodly state on one side of the equation, and then you have these two descriptions of God's love in our hearts and a state of justification, both juxtaposed to the ungodly state, it is reasonable to conclude that Paul envisions the state of justification as identical with the state of having God's love poured forth in our hearts. And this at least proves false the idea that justification does not involve an interior state of holiness. And concerning the church's teaching on this, it at least shows that our interior state of holiness, having sanctifying grace in our souls, is a ground for our justification. Again, more work would have to be done in order to show that it's the only ground or the sole formal cause of our justification, but that's for another time. But at least we can see here that it is contrary to the Bible to reject or deny our interior state of holiness as being involved in our justification. We can affirm that our justification involves our interior state of holiness that God brings about via sanctifying grace. And so, friends, this brings us to the end of this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. Our claim, again, is that the Bible teaches that at least a ground for our justification is a state of interior righteousness that God brings about. And we supported this claim with three passages: Romans 6, 17 through 18, 2 Corinthians 3, 6 through 9, and Romans 5, 1 through 2, and 5 through 8. The Catholic claim, therefore, stands as biblically justified. Friends, thank you so much for listening to The Catholic Reason. Again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. You can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under the audio tab. If you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the air in future episodes, you can do so by emailing me at karlo@stmichaelradio.com. That's karlo@stmichaelradio.com. Friends, I invite you to join me again next week for The Catholic Reason as we continue looking at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless.